Hello and welcome to this webinar, an IT Force webinar, Understanding the Basics of the Dark Web and Mitigating Risks. So a little bit of housekeeping first. You'll notice in your dialog box, there's a questions box, and we like to get questions from the audience. So if you, just a little tip, when the questions come to mind, put them into the dialog box as they're fresh in your mind, but we will deal with them all at the end. So we'll move on then to the agenda, and we'll be joined later by IT4 CTO Mark Skelton, and Mark will be explaining a bit more about the dark web and its history. And then we'll have April O'Brien, who will go through how the solution can help protect SMBs from the cyber criminals. So most of you in attendance would already know IT Force, but for those of you who don't know us, IT Force is an award-winning IT managed services provider. We were founded in 1999, and we've been recognized internationally for the quality of our support and implementation services. Just a very brief thing from me, because I speak with owners and managers of SMBs regularly, and even still, there's a common thread in how many of them think in terms of security. They say things to me like, you know, we're too small for the criminals to be bothered about. We're in operation for years and we've never even heard of anyone being compromised. Well, the fact is, international reports, PwC did a report in 2018 that showed that 43% of cyber attacks are actually directed at SMBs. And they also found that 40% of small businesses even fail to assess the risks they face, never mind doing anything about it. So I think maybe one of the reasons that cyber criminals are directing at SMBs is because of the fact that a large amount of them are actually failing to protect themselves. So the purpose of this webinar, therefore, is to raise awareness so that you, as an attendee, are not in those categories. The fact of the matter is, similar to normal criminals, cyber criminals are opportunistic, and they'll take the path of least resistance. So with that all said, I'm actually going to hand you over now to Mark Skelton, and Mark is going to take you through the next stage. So Mark, can you hear me there okay?
I can hear you fine, John. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, spot on. So I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for that. So you can see me there. My name is Mark Skelton. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for IT Force, so the head techie, basically. In a little while, April, my colleague, is going to be talking about dark web monitoring and what that is, why you should do it, why it's important. But before we get into that, I just wanted to spend just a couple of minutes explaining exactly, well, what is the dark web? There's a lot of maybe misconceptions out there, a lot of misinformation and general confusion as to exactly what it is and maybe to a certain extent what it isn't. Generally, when people talk about the dark web, they'll very often use this iceberg type analogy. I'm sure a lot of you might have seen this type of diagram to describe it. At the highest level, the web is divided into three sections. The bit at the top that we see is called the surface web. Now, this is the internet by and large as we know it. So a couple of key things with the surface web. First of all, you can access it using a standard web browser. So Internet Explorer, Mozilla, Google Chrome, any of them. You don't need anything special. And it can be accessed by anybody from anywhere. So there's no restrictions on it. Now, that second point has an important bearing then. What that means, if you can get to it, or there's no restriction, no passwords, no blocks, it's indexable. So all of our favorite search engines will come along and they will index the website. And that's how it works. So when you go into Google or Bing or whatever and run your search query, they've gone and they've crawled those every available website, and that's where you get your results from. So it's the familiar internet that we're familiar with. Now, it's not to say that it's all good, and this can be another sometimes a bit of confusion. There's lots of, you know, not particularly nice stuff on the surface web. I'm not going to even go there and talk about stuff. You can well imagine if you can go into Google, you can type in, you know, certain key phrases, and you will find stuff that's, how shall we say, morally dubious maybe. That is still not the dark web, because you've got there on a standard browser, you've got there through through a Google search or through an internet search. The dark web is something different. Those other companies, you can say what you want about them, but they are, I'll use the word very loosely, legitimate in that people know where they are, they're traceable, they're accessible. And that's not what the dark web is. If we go down beneath the surface web, there's a thing called the deep web. And again, sometimes people use the word deep web and dark web interchangeably, and that is not the case always. Surprisingly enough, the surface web probably only accounts for about 1% of what's out there. It's actually difficult to know, which means about 99% of that iceberg is below water. Now, most of what's on the deep web is perfectly legitimate. It's deep for a good reason. So for example, I would hate to think that somebody could just go into a search engine and type Mark Skelton bank account details and immediately be led into my online banking and be able to have a good look around. Clearly, in that case, there's password protection and other protections in place, and there's all manner. That's why the vast majority of what's, servers that are connected to the internet, they have password protection in place. There might be a public part of it that's accessible, and then huge amounts of it which are not publicly and easily accessible. Now, and then for that reason, they will not appear in search engine searches because the search engines can't get in there either. So, and as I says, the vast majority of the deep web is just that. It's perfectly ordinary, banal, often safe content, but it's just not easily accessible. And the other key point with the deep web is that it's accessible or usable over a standard browser. Now, let's now get into the dark web. I'll just try a different slide for this. The dark web is way down the bottom. And it is something entirely different. It's typically, as part of this conversation, it's where all the bad stuff goes on, really. So there's a couple of key points to it. Number one, it is intentionally hidden and it is obfuscated. And by that I mean is that it's bordering on impossible, not impossible, we'll come back to that in a bit, but it's very, very difficult to trace either the person who's browsing, so going and looking at it, or the person who's serving up the content or putting up the web servers in this case. And that obviously leads to all sorts. So that basically means people can do all sorts of illegal activity on it with very, very little chance of them being caught. The other big thing with the darknet is you cannot get at it with a standard browser. So there's no chance that you can sit down with your Google Chrome or your Firefox browser and accidentally find yourself on the dark web. That's not how it works. You have to do this intentionally. I'm not going to get into a tutorial on this. The one thing I'll just pause for a second here to say is that I would really strongly urge people to have nothing to do with the dark web. It's not difficult to get onto it. By definition, it's publicly accessible. You do have to go and get a piece of software and you do have to make a little bit of an effort to do it, but I would strongly urge you not to do it. Sometimes you hear of people just out of curiosity, I must see what this thing is about. Just don't go there. And in fact, part of the whole part of this webinar is I would suggest get a third party to do this for you, people who specialize in this, for them to search for your details and make sure that they're not there, or if they are, to find them. Okay. Question, I suppose, that people might be on people's minds is, well, where on earth did all of this come from? Where did this dark web come from? And in some ways, it's been around for a long time. I mean, since the very early days of the internet back in take the late 60s or early 70s, wherever you want to say it, certainly by the 70s. There's been elements of the web that weren't accessible easily and that maybe had somewhat dodgy goings on them. But really, it was in the late 90s when the thing started to grow legs. Somewhat ironically, it was actually the US military, I believe the US Naval Research Labs, that produced a thing called the Onion Router. Or Tor. Now, it's called the onion because that's got to do with how the routing works. I don't want to get into technicalities here, but you think of an onion, they basically put in layer after layer after layer of encryption, and each hop that it goes along, it strips off a layer, like pulling off the layers of an onion. And that's what makes it very, very, very difficult to trace traffic that's on the internet. It's probably worth mentioning that there's actually more than one dark web. Again, I don't want to dwell on that or turn this into a tutorial. There's 5 or 6 or 7 of them, I forget now. But really, Tor is the big one, and it's the vast majority of the really nasty stuff that's out there is on Tor, which is why people will often, when they talk about the dark web, they'll really be talking about Tor. But there are others, and it's probably worth mentioning that not everything is, there are legitimate reasons and legitimate uses for the dark web. People use it. Often people in, say, countries that have strong censorship laws, they might use it to get their information out with very little chance of them being, them being caught. And indeed, that was the original idea of it when it was used as a sort of a spying mechanism. Now, again, without in any way wanting to get into tutorial here, how do people use the dark web? And the key tool that people use are what are called dark web markets. Now, the analogy here is eBay or Amazon that we would use on the surface web. So you can go in there, you can buy stuff, you can sell stuff. Reasonably legitimately. There is the same idea on the dark web. You have these markets. Again, I'm not going to advertise them. There's probably 10 or 11 really big ones at the moment. They come and go. I will mention Silk Road because that was the first one that really got big back, I'm losing track of the years, probably back in 2013, I should say, maybe 12, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I forget now. That sort of exploded and it became huge and it made an absolute fortune. For a while anyways, for its owners. I did mention earlier it was very difficult to trace stuff on it, but not impossible, and eventually they did catch them and they did shut them down, based for drug dealing effectively. And I believe all of the people who ran it, or most of them, are in jail now for very, very long stretches. Now, Silk Road has come back again in various guises, and there are other ones out there. So I'm just going to recap a little bit here and just go back over what I was saying. This idea of the dark web, surface web, key point here is that it's indexed, it's freely available, and you use a standard browser. And I says it ain't all good, but it's certainly not the dark web. Then you have the deep web, which is the vast majority of the internet. It's accessible for the most part using a standard browser, but it's password protected or otherwise hidden, and therefore it's not indexed or searchable. And then you have this dark web down right at the bottom. That's the bit, this is where the bad stuff is going. Now, why is this relevant, and why are we talking about it here? We'll assume, hopefully, you're not all going to go out and start trying to buy drugs or hire a hitman on the dark web. Why it's relevant to businesses is that your information could be sitting out there, freely available or for sale on the dark web. So you've been used for identity fraud. Take, for example, if I was a hacker and I managed to hack, say, a major email provider, and I got a couple of million email addresses and nice passwords and maybe dates of birth and other information. The first thing I'm probably going to do is I'm going to try and sell it on the dark web because it's worth money, particularly if it's valid. And therein lies the danger. So your details could well be out on the dark web. I won't get into too much detail because April is going to cover off on it, but that's the key point here I wanted to get across, and that's why it's important that this be monitored. But I would say, heaven forbid, don't even think about trying to do this yourself. You're going to end up getting into places that really you don't want to be. I would leave this to the experts. I think at this stage I might hand over to my colleague April, who's from a company called ID Agent. I'm not too sure if you're there, April.
I am here. Thank you very much, Mark.
Excellent.
A little bit about ID. Okay.
I'm just going to fumble for a couple of seconds, and I'm just going to change presenter. So everybody just bear with me for a couple of seconds while I fumble my way through this, and then I'll leave you.
And while he's doing that, I will say that ID Agent has been around a long time. It is actually about 8 years that we have been monitoring the dark web, and we started off with monitoring for the U.S. government in a situation they had. So we have been gathering information. I just heard from one of our tech team yesterday that we have billions of records in the information that we have gathered over the dark web for a long period of time. I want to talk a little bit about the compromised credential piece of it. So people are like, so my email is out there, your email is everywhere, but a compromised credential is something very important to a cyber attacker or a cyber criminal, because this is how they will gain access to your information, whether that is your bank account, whether it is your server at work, whether it is a website that you visit with that particular email and password. They will use that information to be able to get into your information to be able to make money. That's the whole reason they're there. They are there to try and figure out ways of making money off of your compromised credential. One of the things that has happened recently is that there are more and more of these cyber criminals because it has turned out to be lucrative for many of them, and these new hackers, they, as was mentioned earlier, they take the path of least resistance. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit, people that aren't paying attention to their credentials. In some cases, that is personal identity, but you know what? The small businesses make it easier because you haven't been paying attention to it. You have had no real reason that hasn't been brought to the fore, but because of the increase of the hackers, as well as the increased activity that they have figured out ways of making money, they start with the small businesses, and it has exploded. Small businesses are at a great risk, and I believe John mentioned earlier that there is a significant number of small businesses that's where they start. Again, talking about, they are easy to get into. One of the things that people have observed that, it hasn't been really big news, right? So you hear about the banks, and you hear about the airlines, and you hear about the large corporations, but you don't hear about the small business that is at risk. It's just not big news, and people don't want to publicize it as well. One of the things that has happened, people have a longer presence on the internet. As you grow your business, you have more and more people that are your employees using your domain and their internet email. So that gives you a little bit more of risk as well. And what they try to do is they figure out the credit cards, they may get your employees' personal information and be able to attack through phishing. Or if they're really damaging, they can go and get your client information and be able to either blackmail or ransom or do other kind of awful things. One of the things that is not always mentioned, people talk about cyber insurance. Well, I'll get cyber insurance, and if something happens, I'll be able to pay my way out of it. It may cover much of the monetary damage, but if a hacker does get the information that is your client information, and your clients are exposed to the risk as well, there goes your reputation, and the cyber insurance will not be able to cover loss of reputation, and that can really damage long-term business, which is maybe one of the reasons that 43%, as we talked about, they do target, but 60% of the small companies can go out of business. This has been documented over a long period of time, within 6 months. And part of the reason is that they may be able to withstand the initial assault and be able to come up with whatever money, but long term there is a loss of business, there is a loss of maybe information and data, and then again you have that reputation piece that goes in it as well. So you don't hear about most of these attacks because, again, who is going to want to publicize that I've been hacked? So emphasizing that 60% one more time, thinking about if you were compromised, if your business was exposed and they were able to get in, and whether it's ransomware or they were able to access your accounts or whatever, could your business come up with the £3,000 to £10,000 or maybe even more that they would demand and that you may have to come up with? And then there is the recovery of the data. Did you get it all? All of that downtime for 2 to 4 weeks, and will your customers still be there? So that 60% is, again, something you may not see or hear of a lot, but it is definitely out there. Cybercrime, as I mentioned, is on the rise. The stolen passwords is the big thing, and that's what we find on the dark web with our scans and storage of information. And what's really interesting is that most of the businesses with less than 1,000 employees, they don't even know if they've been hacked when it happens. And this happens a lot. They may go in and get a little bit here, a little bit there. They may just be accessing the employee information and being able to get that, or accessing the client information, which takes them up to the next level of perhaps a larger business. So whatever happens, the idea is that a compromised credential, when it shows up, is not only your email, but it's an email and your password, and or it could be public personal identity information, things like your username, your passport, your date of birth, all those things that you use to answer those questions to be able to get in and sign into your websites. This big thing of don't even know, knowledge is power, and being able to know when you're compromised is the key. 76% of the people will use the same password. It's just one of those things that we've been doing as human nature. We want to say, okay, I'll use this password. I'll add an exclamation mark. I'll do a 1, 2, 3. I'll do something in the beginning or the end. The hackers all know this, and they have tools and methods and strategies to be able to overcome that. They can run programs to be able to figure out all the variations of the passwords. They don't even have to think about it. They have these tools available. Unfortunately, when you are using that same password, whether it's for your business or maybe even other places out on the internet, remember that your business and your employees have been doing business out on the internet, whether you're going into your payroll or whether you're ordering office supplies online or your banking. You are doing business outside of the four walls that IT Force is protecting you in. So when you are out here, this is where you are most vulnerable, because this is where they can get the information to get into your business, to get into your information, to do phishing scams, to do other things. This is where a lot of that data and what we find to be able to put into our system to be able to tell you whether or not you've been compromised. And you're like, okay, great. So what do I do? So the idea is that knowing, and I go back to the knowledge is power, when you have a way of knowing that you've been compromised, the sooner you act upon it, the better it's going to be. I had a figure pop up earlier this year that said the average time that a hacker would hold on to the data is 267 days. Such an odd number. But they use all those tools and strategies to figure it out. But the sooner you know that the information is out there, you can go in and take steps to mitigate your risk. Once the information is there, you can't get rid of it, you can't change it, you can't make it go away. But IT Force, with this tool and the knowledge of power, can help you be able to say, you know what, this has happened, let's do this. But they're not going to know about it, and you're not going to know about it unless you are actively monitoring the dark web. And it's strange, but a lot of people think that, you know what, I don't want to know about it. I don't have to know about it. I've got all these other things that I need to work on and do. But if you ignore it, then you run the risk of being hacked, of being compromised, of having your employees and your customers. So don't be the ostrich. The role of monitoring, it really is just a piece of the puzzle. Again, knowing about it will help. There's the dark web monitoring, knowing the data. You also will be able to help change your culture, to be able to do testing and training and be able to help your employees be more knowledgeable about what goes on. I call it building the human firewall, so that they can be actively thinking about best practices and best ways of making things happen. And then you can also do vulnerability scans as well as, testing. Again, these are things that IT Force can help you with. They will pull all these pieces together, but again, knowledge is a piece of that puzzle. A little bit about how it all works and what is available. What happens is you are going to be signed up with your domain for an ongoing monitoring. That happens all the time. The ways we find that information is through all things dark web. Dark web is an interesting place. It's an ever-changing place, and Mark went through some of those pieces. Don't go there. It's just not one of the places that you want to be caught, because they take great offense on people trying to find information. Unless you are trained and familiar, it is not a place to be. But we do have people. We have people that actually are in the chat rooms, that are looking at places in the dark web. They're in the forums listening to what's going on. Of course, we have data that we capture. One of the interesting things about the dark web is that information is available and then it is not. Websites that search the dark web come and go. Places to find data changes on a regular basis, and those forums and chat rooms are how the hackers keep up with each other to know what's going on. And we have people in there looking and hearing and listening to all of this information. In addition to being on the dark web, we also have human analysts that look at the data when it comes through. There's a whole lot of junk out there that, there's false positive, there's just a list of emails with made up passwords. There's all kind of information that may not be real. And what our human analysts do, they try to give as much attribution as they can, and they try to verify as much as possible that this is not duplicated, that this is not just something somebody made up. That is when it gets put into our platform for you to be able to see the information. So you're not wasting time trying to look at things that don't really matter. When you sign up, you have your domain monitored. It's 24 hours. Again, you may want to change the password. You may want to have IT Force help you with other things. It just enables IT Force to be aware and help you to mitigate a possible attack. Again, knowing in advance, knowing as soon as possible, knowing before the hacker has a chance to go in and log into your bank account, it's a good idea. One of the tools they have is a live data search tool. And with this live data search tool, you have the ability of being able to see the history of the information. And let me give you an example real quick here. This is what the tool looks like, and you can see that I've put in example.co. This is information gathered over a long period of time. I've seen it as far back as 2009. Usually it's about 2011, 2012 that the information starts showing up. You can see that this particular domain has over 2,700 compromises. Again, this is an example, so it's not real, but this is the kind of information you would be able to see for your business as well. You have the date the information is found. You have the actual email address. The password is masked. You only show the first 4 characters. Usually this is enough to be able to say, yeah, that's a password that I use. And then you can see that we do try to give, where it came from, how it happened, and then of course where we found it. ID theft forum is our catch-all term for dark web sites, things like that. But there's a lot of data that shows up. You have some cases that there is an encrypted password. You know what? The hacker now has your username, and again, with those tools, we'll be able to potentially figure out what that password is if they don't already have the key, and be able to get into other websites, because they're going to be able to find you on LinkedIn. They're going to be able to figure out whether or not from your website who are the key people in the company. They're going to try and make money off of this information. So that gives you an example of what kind of information is found on the dark web with the tool, and I believe IT Force is going to be able to make that available to you as well. Just a closing thought, the sooner the better. Don't hesitate. This tool is available to small and medium-sized businesses. We were the first ones that were making this available, and we have the most human activity and tracking and giving good attribution as anything out there. This tool and this kind of idea have been available for enterprise businesses, larger businesses, for a longer period of time. It is now available to the small and medium-sized businesses to be able to give you the ability to monitor the dark web and be able to figure out if your business has been compromised. And with that, John, I believe I am handing it back to you, and I will go through the same exercise as Mark or John. Who would like to have the screen?
April, thank you for that, and you can hand the screen back to Mark.
Okay, he's got it.
Okay, good. So thank you very much, April and Mark, indeed. That was very informative, and I hope everybody got something from it. We have got a couple of questions, and the first one is, our server is already protected, and we use two-factor authentication. Why should I be worried if passwords end up on the dark web? Do you want to deal with that one, Mark?
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, first of all, I'd say, well done. I would strongly recommend multi-factor authentication. In fact, if you do nothing else in IT security, I would say that start there. Multi-factor authentication just adds a huge layer of security to your identity, but it's not foolproof. And I suppose the key thing here is it's important to understand that it's not just your corporate stuff that they're after. So, for instance, if somebody managed to get my Mark Skelton, IT Force credentials, hopefully they wouldn't be able to get in. But the next thing they're going to do is they're going to start targeting my webmail, and they're going to start targeting my Facebook, if I had one, and they're going to start targeting other systems. April mentioned it earlier. People have a tendency, it's a human nature, to recycle passwords. And when I say recycle, reuse the same password or a very similar variant of a password. If you're married to a girl called Mary, the word Mary hopefully might be somewhere in your password. Hopefully not some other girl, and even numbers and things like that. Once they're armed with that information, they can use that to come at you from other angles. And it's not, whilst password theft is very large, it's not the only theft that they're after. It could be, other information, hopefully not credit card details, dates of births, other information which they can use to launch attacks against you. But so multi-factor authentication is very, very good. I would heartily recommend it, but it's not. IT security is really all about strength and depth. You want to be using every single tool that you have in your artillery to protect yourself, because the bad guys are doing this. This is what they're doing against you. So you should use it. So I'm hoping that that's answered the question, at least in some way.
Thanks, Mark. That's good. So we have a second question. April, I think I might just direct this to you. And the question is, what if we just rotate our passwords every 60 days? I presume they're suggesting, is that not enough? Would, if somebody finds something 60 days password rotation, is that not enough?
As far as I got it. The password rotation, I've heard different schools of thought on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But even if you are doing the password rotation, remember that that's just the password in your internal business. So if you're doing that, great. It does change it, makes it harder for it to get in. But let's say that on the day after you change that password, your identity is compromised. What do you do with the other 59 days? I mean, how are you going to know if that password has all of a sudden gotten out there? So the idea is, again, knowing as soon as possible to be able to go in and figure out what's going on. So the changing of the passwords is yes, every 60 days is great. You can't do it every day, and I certainly wouldn't recommend that. Knowing what you see on the dark web might help you be able to additionally reinforce. Mark, I love your strength and depth. I just wrote that one down. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you for that, April. So now I've thanked April and Mark and I'd also just like to thank all the attendees for taking time out of their day. And as a thank you to them, we plan to run a free dark web scan for every organization that's attended today. We also had planned to send you out a copy of this webinar, and that will come from Kieran within the next, I'd say, 24, 48 hours. So if you wish to avail of the free dark web scan, simply respond to Kieran's email and let him know, and we'll organize that for you. So I hope that's okay. So I think we're at the end of it now. So I think we'll just wrap it up there. So thank you all and everybody for attending, and thank you to the contributors.